Hi, everyone. This is Raquel.
Hi, and this is Jennifer.
Welcome to Madness Cafe.
This is a feminist podcast where we talk about women's issues, politics, and health and wellness.
And where those issues intersect. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Madness Cafe. Today, Jennifer and I are going to talk about a topic that really does not get talked about enough at all. So we're very excited about this. It's kind of a quote unquote taboo topic, colorism. And to help us talk about this is Dr. Sarah Webb. She is the founder of Colorism Healing, a global leader in raising awareness, shifting attitudes, and taking action to address colorism with corporate, consumer, and community strategies. That is a very tall order. Dr. Webb, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for, leveraging your platform for this important discussion. I agree it's not talked about often enough. And so I'm thrilled that you all are part of the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. I feel a little awestruck. Dr. Webb, what is your story and how did you get started doing this work in particular?
I grew up in South Louisiana in a multicolored family. My immediate family, although we all identify as African American, my mom and sister are many shades lighter than I am, have a slightly different hair texture. And I noticed growing up that people treated us differently because of that. I mean, starting from the very basic stuff of not even realizing or believing we're sisters, or that my mom is my mom, or that also my sister and I not only having the same mom, but also having the same dad, and people not being able to compute that in their heads. But then to more, significant things like when I was in maybe first grade, I had a friend who was not Black. I can't say for sure if she was white or not, but I know she wasn't Black. And so she and I got into an argument, like, first graders do. And her retaliation was to go across the room to my sister and say, well, that's why I like your sister better than you, because she's white and you're Black, right? Because in her mind, my sister's skin tone read or perceived to her as, white, closer to whiteness. And so I think having those experiences early on, I knew something was wrong, but like many people I talked to today, I had no idea what it was. Like I had no words, no language, no framework to process that or to understand it. And when I would try to kind of describe it, people would shut it down or dismiss it. Yeah. But when I was teaching high school in 2010, 2011, I heard a lot of my African-American students saying very similar things about their own skin tones, that they were less proud because they got too dark over the summer. They didn't like photographs of themselves because they were too dark in the photo. And I realized, oh, no, this is a thing, right? This wasn't just me and my personal experiences, but it's continuing for another generation. And so I started blogging about it because my formal training is in writing and literature. And so when I began trying to address this topic and research and study it, it really started from, reading about it and then also writing about it. And then over the years, since 2011, people have invited me onto podcasts and like say, oh, can you come and talk to my students at this school, or, teach a workshop for this group of teachers. And so that was kind of always, just kind of ad hoc work. And then it was a couple of years ago where it's like, there's potential to do this full time, because I was, in 2018, I got a job as a tenure track professor at a university in Illinois. And it got to a point where grading was distracting me from my colorism healing work. And I was like, this is a sign that I need that my heart has really been trying to push me out there, and then it got to a point where I just couldn't ignore it anymore. And it's like, I've been kind of in the back of my mind wanting to secretly do this full time and focus solely on colorism healing work. And so I took that leap in 2022 to go all in with, so I do public speaking and trainings and consulting, but also I have the work I built up over the years, like the International Writing Contest, support group for dark-skinned women, and more, I think, community-focused stuff that still is very fulfilling and very rewarding.
Is there a definition of colorism that we start with?
Yes, I think that's a great place to start. So colorism is a social system a social hierarchy that creates privileges and advantages and greater access to resources and capital for people with lighter skin tones, and that marginalizes and discriminates against and stigmatizes people with darker skin tones. And that includes people of the same race. And so it's not just between races, but even amongst people of the same race, we see these differential outcomes and differences and bias or perceived value based on how light or how dark the skin tone is.
And I think it's important to note, Dr. Webb, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not just within the Black race.
Correct.
There are lots of other cultures
absolutely.
who also deal with colorism in very similar, or who experience colorism in very similar ways.
Absolutely. That is 100% true. And that is an epiphany for so many people. Like with the International Writing Contest, I have people say, I thought it was just my culture. I was shocked to participate in this contest and have people from across the globe who speak different languages have very, very similar experiences. And also, me coming from the United States, when I started researching colorism and started looking at the global discourse, I realized that it's actually also more explicit in some other countries. I think there are certain things that are more taboo in the United States, so things tend to be more implied. There aren't as many anymore overt skin bleaching ads, right? There were in the 1950s, 1960s, right? Like explicit advertisements for this is a skin bleaching product. But over the last few decades, that has become more of a taboo thing. And so it's more of an underground market. But in other countries like India, China, the advertisements and the market for skin bleaching is very much mainstream. And so you'll see like regular television ads, billboards for skin bleaching creams. And so I think we have global patterns, even though there are regional nuances and slight differences between cultures, we definitely see the consistent pattern of those with the fairer skin tones having more status, higher status in society.
Yeah, in fact, there's a woman that I used to work with who is Indian. She's from India and her parents are both from India. She talks about how her dad's family treated her mom's her mom differently because they were differing shades, and that she was a bit darker than her dad, so they treated her not so great. It does happen, and it's not just with Black people.
What are the consequences to the people in our lives? Like, what are the things that colorism creates for people?
Colorism is a wound, and it's an emotional wound and a psychological wound. Sometimes it can even manifest as physical wounds, depending on people's coping styles of responding to colorism. But definitely it starts with that individual level of, if I am being perceived this way in society, and that becomes an image that I accept or start to believe about myself, right? I talk about society being a mirror, our relationships with other people being mirrors. And so if all of our mirrors are distorted and are giving this negative projection of us, then that negatively impacts how we perceive ourselves. And so I talk about internalized colorism, not only with like struggles with self-esteem and struggles with self-acceptance and self-love, but also even your perceived sense of worth and value, right? And so are you then afraid to pursue a singing career, right? Because you're like, well, they're not even going to see me, or they're not going to, if I go to this audition, they're just going to pass me up for the lighter skinned person. Kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy on the individual level. And then I talk about other tiers, right? These concentric circles. So beyond the individual level is the relational level. And so it definitely has frayed relationships. I was fortunate that even though my mom and sister are different skin tones than me, we are still best friends. But for far too many people, that's not the case. I was on a panel yesterday, and one of the women was saying how her mother really forced skin bleaching creams on her and kept telling her entire life, you need to use these creams. And a lot of people say their mothers tell them not to wear red lipstick because they're too dark. And so all these relationships in our lives where if someone has adopted or accepted that philosophy or that ideology, then they can cause harm towards others. And then oftentimes that harbors resentment. And so it's really hard to trust each other across, the skin tone spectrum sometimes. And then I think there's a systemic impact too. And so I always have to say that because colorism is definitely not just the individual impact, but we see pay inequality. We see differential treatment in the healthcare system. Catalyst came out with a recent study. People have been sharing it because the chart that they gave is so illustrative of how darker skinned women report more experiences of racism in the workplace than women with light skin tones. And they really show the spectrum. And so I talk about how colorism is a spectrum of privilege, because a lot of times people wonder where they fall in the system, like how they're positioned. And so I always say most people fall kind of close to the middle. So in one context, you might be the lightest person in the room, and that same person in a different space or a different context could have the darkest skin tone in the room. And that can impact their experiences of their identity or their relative privilege or lack of privilege. But yeah, so we see that there actually is a class system that correlates to the color hierarchy. And so it's not just about perceived social value, but actual access to capital, wealth, jobs. And because it's a historical thing as well, these things have become generational cycles, right? And so when we look at people who have had lighter skinned grandparents, right? Or mixed race grandparents, even if they themselves aren't very light, right? They still had that generational advantage as well. So it's far reaching in terms of its impacts, but when we're looking at the individuals around us, I think we have to be aware of the impact on self-worth in particular, and consider that when we're trying to repair and build connections between each other.
Well, that's a great bridge. How can we repair and build connections? That's big work.
Yes. I'm glad you acknowledge that, because sometimes when people ask that question, part of me wonders if they want the magic pill. And I heard someone actually say that, give us the magic pill, and I don't have one.
There is no magic pill. Take work.
It is. And it's ongoing work. And I think colorism aside, human work is ongoing work, right? And I'm like, my relationship with myself is imperfect. So I can't expect external relationships to be perfect, you know? So there's that bit. We just also have to give ourselves grace as being humans. But in the realm of colorism specifically, and of course this can apply to other things as well, we have to have the language and we have to have the awareness that this is a real system in place. Because I think for so long and for so many people, it has been unsaid and unspoken. And like you mentioned, Raquel, at the beginning, it's that taboo thing. And I think that makes the wound fester, right? Yeah. But as soon as we can air it out, it gives us the opportunity to start to heal. Yeah. And then the second thing is, again, we have to be accountable for how we are positioned. And so if we are lighter skinned, if we're medium brown skinned, if we're dark skinned, but not very dark skinned, because I also look at myself and I very much see myself as dark skinned, but I know that there are people who are several shades darker than me. And so understanding that there is a range of privilege and acknowledging that, not running away from that, because we think about how do we build trust? And for someone who's more marginalized than me to have trust, they have to see me acknowledge where I'm positioned. They have to see me acknowledge when I get a benefit that they don't get, right? And so it's the same across the entire spectrum. And then as I'm saying that, I also want to note that colorism, like all issues, is intersectional. And I think, so for me, I try to role model what it looks like to stand in my privileges, not try to dismiss them or deny them, but to say, if I don't acknowledge this, then I'm being irresponsible with it, right? And so how am I being responsible for the privilege that I do have, right? Being in a dark-skinned body, but being in a skinny body, being in a, typically abled body, right? Being in an American body, right? Or a cisgendered body, and all those ways that I have privilege compared to people who are also dark-skinned, but might be transgender or might have a disability, right? And so as I advocate, going forward, one of the things I want to continue expanding in my work is increasing representation for diverse dark-skinned people. Not all of us are like the Gabrielle Union, right? Yeah. I think a lot of times in popular discourse around colorism, and it's necessary, right? It's okay to have that focus, but in a lot of the social media conversations and the news media conversations, magazine conversations around colorism, it is focused on, straight, cisgendered, able-bodied, skinny Black women. Many times, they have straight hair even, right? Or like a thinner nose. And so realizing that there's a matrix or there are matrices of privilege and identity, and we all have to constantly be assessing and doing our inner work and making sure we are being accountable for how we show up in spaces and acknowledging that here's where I'm marginalized, but here's where I have agency. And here's where I have some empowerment to take ownership of where I am privileged.
I want to touch on a little bit of what you said about sometimes it can be internalized.
Mm-hmm.
It's only been, say, like very recent, like in the last maybe couple of years, that I've come to terms with my own internalized colorism. And it's always directed at me. It's never directed at other people, right? Like growing up, and I didn't have words for it, or I didn't quite understand why, but even now I have this weirdness that any woman who is lighter than me or has longer hair than me is automatically prettier than me, automatically. And I know now, I mean, after years of living with this, it's only in the last few years that I realized that this is an internalized colorism, it's internalized racism, it's all of these things. In your TED Talk, which we're going to put a link to that in our show notes, in your TED Talk, you specifically talk about how can we heal from colorism. In fact, the title of your TED Talk is How Can We Heal from the Shades of Colorism? And you give 3 really amazing steps. And then you say this beautiful poem that I wrote down and will one day commit to memory. But you give this really important information about how colorism isn't just out there, it's in here too. We're affected by the same things that the rest of the society is as a whole is affected by. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. I want to say, as you were saying, you automatically feel that people who are lighter than you or have longer, straighter hair than you are automatically prettier. And sometimes there are tiers to it. And so sometimes we really believe that other person is prettier. And sometimes we really believe that other people will see that person as prettier. And I think for me,
yes to both of those for me.
Yes. And I think that the second half is what conditioned the first part, right? Like, so I actually believe that person is prettier because everyone else does, right? And so I think once we start to understand how input works and how social conditioning works, classic conditioning, I think that can actually be an empowering thing. So what I tell people is that realizing that these beliefs have been conditioned, that could be freeing and empowering, because if something can be conditioned in one direction, it can be unconditioned or reconditioned or deconditioned, right? Now, that again, that conditioning didn't happen overnight in most cases, right? It took years and an inundation. I think oftentimes we underestimate how much conditioning we're actually up against, because people say, oh, just tell your daughter she's pretty every day and that should do it. And we're like, no, because there are 1,000 inputs of colorism and, white supremacist ideology and anti-Black rhetoric and things, like just thousands and thousands of inputs. And what we know from psychology is that for every negative piece of feedback, it takes, 4 to 6 pieces of positive feedback to counteract it. And so most of us can attest to the fact that we're not getting 4 to 6 positive reinforcements every time we see an insult, or every time we see something racist, or every time we see, the lighter skinned person getting the job we know we were really qualified for. But I think just having that math in your head at least gives you a path, helps you to see like what the equation is, even if it's going to be a headache to actually start to work through it. And so for me, it was, and that I talk about the song, back home, they're scared, oh, so scared of me that I became scared of me. And so it's again, realizing that when people are reflecting back to us a mirror, and we've only ever seen that mirror, then that's the belief we start to have. And so I think there's a lot of power now that we live in a time in the world where we can have access to alternative mirrors. And I think the alternative mirror is really, for some people, like a saving grace. Lupita Nyong'o talked about, for her, was the model Alec Weck, and the actor actress Whoopi Goldberg, people talk about Cicely Tyson as actresses. For some people, it's meeting that teacher or that mentor or that coach that sees them for the first time. Now it might be the Instagram account that you stumble upon, and there are hundreds of images of people who look like you and who are portrayed in an affirming, loving light. Or it could be documentaries that are coming out now. And so I think when you have agency to do so, limit and start to reduce and to your capacity, right? If you can go cold turkey, that's great. I think most of us probably won't go cold turkey, but limit to whatever capacity you have, your exposure to the colorist things. And here's the thing too. Every time someone starts to follow my page or listen to my videos, they say, I'm seeing more colorism. I'm starting to recognize it more. And I think the mere recognition is a manifestation of not internalizing it, right? And so there's the study of how we learn things, right? A lot of times people say, oh, it's just entertainment. It's just a joke, right? And it's really when you think you're not learning that the deepest conditioning is happening, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you're being brainwashed, you're less likely to take it in. You have that cognitive guard up. But if you think it's just a movie, it's just a cartoon, then your cognitive defenses are down, and it's that much more effective, right? The conditioning is that much more effective. So I also say the simple act of looking for colorism, right, is a buffer, is a barrier to then constantly internalizing it. So once you start to recognize it, then you can say, those music videos are colorist. I'm not going to play those music videos anymore. Mm-hmm. Or this YouTuber, now that I love their travel videos, but I realize that they only ever use stock footages of white people or very light people, right? Or people with straight hair. And so I'm going to find travel vloggers. Since I love travel, I'm going to start to look for dark-skinned travel vloggers or travel vloggers with, natural Afro-textured hairs, right? To diversify my input. And I think that is an accessible way for a lot of people to start, is to kind of do a self-audit of your inputs. And that can definitely impact your then outputs as well. I know that was a lot.
No,
that's amazing. You talked about it a little bit, but are there ways to actually unlearn the skin color bias?
Yeah. So I think the first piece to unlearning is to recognize what has to be unlearned. And that takes a great degree of courage. I also think part of the healing process has to be met with a great degree of courage and compassion and self-forgiveness, because what happens is we realize we've had a colorist belief or this, anti-Black attitude or this preference for lighter skin tones. And then we can start hating ourselves all over again for that. And so I think the healing process requires self-compassion, self-forgiveness. There was a time when I got down on my knees and prayed to God for long, straight hair. I was like, God, please just give me long, straight hair that flows down my back, right? And I was a kid, but, you start to see these things. It's like, I understand why I was there. I understand where that came from. There was something going around where, if you're born in the ocean, don't wonder why you're wet. Don't wonder why you come out wet. And so we were born in white supremacist cultures, anti-Black cultures. We shouldn't be surprised or ashamed or feel guilty that we got some of that stuff on us or a whole lot of that stuff on us. I think more so once we start to recognize it is think of it as now you're in an empowered place, right? As long as you're able to start recognizing it, you actually are empowered to then start to free yourself from it. And I think that recognition is, like a 12-step process almost, right? That first part is like, I have been colorist. I have had these ideas. I have a problem. Yes. My name is Sarah Webb, and I have had colorist beliefs, and I am on a path to recovery. What I try to get people to do is to actually track for yourself. So people who are into journaling or any type of self-reflection practice is to journal where you are. Once you come to that consciousness and awareness is to just gauge for yourself, the degree to which I dislike my skin tone or the degree to which I don't like my hair texture. Is it 50%? Is it 100% dislike? And then check back in a month after you've been doing your work, after you've been changing your outputs, after you've been changing the people you surround yourself with, right? So that's another hard part. that might be a whole episode just by itself, right? How do we navigate relationships with colorist people in our families or our friendship circles, our colleagues? But, a month later say, okay, well, last month I 100% had disdain for my skin tone. This month I'm only at 88%, right? And so I only feel it, I don't feel it as strongly today as I did yesterday. And I think sticking with the process. And actually, I was thinking about that this morning. The Finding Nemo, just keep swimming.
Yeah,
I was like, I should make a meme called "Just Keep Healing." Just keep healing.
I love it.
Just keep healing. It's like, okay, I had a bad day, but just keep healing. Just keep
healing. Just keep healing. I like it.
And I did this for myself too. I always say that I have tried everything that I suggest, and what I found is, over time, and like with clients that I've worked with too, is that for some people, like that problem or that issue like drops off completely. They're like, I don't even think about this anymore. Or it's like, yeah, I'm definitely still dealing with this, but it's like kind of in the back of my mind now. It's more of like a back burner thing for me as I'm going through this process. And so I think that is a really concrete practice because it keeps you motivated. Because sometimes you're in the healing process and you're like, nothing's changing and I'm exactly where I was 10 years ago. But if you have a journal, you can say, some patterns are reoccurring, but they're a little different. Like there has been some progress, and like, oh, I was worried about that 5 years ago, and I haven't thought about that, and gosh, I don't know how long. So I think keeping track of your progress can actually help you to externalize it, right? Like you write down the thoughts, and so you can see them as things, but also in order to help you persist in the healing work, having that record of your milestones and the journey that you've been on, I think is really helpful.
I love it. That's really great information and really good suggestions about that. You touched on this a little bit earlier where you talked about there is colorism even in the workplace where people who are lighter skinned get paid more, that sort of thing. Can you talk about other ways that colorism shows up in the workplace and why it's necessary for us to combat it and how we can combat it in the workplace? Mm-hmm. I mean, I know that's a huge question, a huge ask, but I think it's important for us to talk about. And I think people would probably get a little perturbed if I didn't ask, because you did bring it up earlier. So I think it's important for us to talk about.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's a huge topic, but I'll try to say something to get people started. And then again, I always say this cannot be your last conversation on colorism. So that you'll just have to like have another conversation, like not only the podcast, but like to anyone who's listening. If this is your first conversation about colorism, it definitely should not be your last. But it shows up in the entire workplace pipeline, I like to call it. So it starts off with the educational pipeline where we see disparities in educational outcomes. Then we see disparities in like the actual hiring process. And then once people are hired, they face like barriers to inclusion, like feeling included, microaggressions, micro assaults, and that kind of are, as people say these days, just aggression and assaults. And then thinking about their promotion, and then thinking about like their like physical wellness, right? Because research studies talk about like the stress of colorism, creating more disease in the body, more stress-related illnesses and disorders because you're dealing with that extra pressure. But thinking about where a lot of it comes from, a lot of the colorism in the workplace stems from the belief or the perception, the stereotype that people with lighter skin are more quote unquote European features and phenotypes, are more intelligent, are more professional, are more approachable. I think that's a big stereotype that creates kind of benefits lighter skinned people and is a disadvantage to darker skinned people who are often seen as the opposite. Well, you're so aggressive and, can you just be a little bit nicer? Or, oh, you're the manager, right? Like if you get called to the front. And this happens like racially, but it definitely happens in terms of like skin tone and that sort of thing. Another thing people can recognize is what I call monochromatic diversity.
Oh, I was hoping you would bring this up.
So this often happens in the workplace where there's racial diversity. There are people of different races. There are people of different ethnic backgrounds and nationalities, but they're all on the lighter side of the skin tone spectrum. And they all might have like straighter hair types or something like that. And so even if there's diversity on paper, if you were to walk in the room or look at the company website, it would be harder to perceive that diversity based on the similarities of everyone's skin tone. And so I think that's something that people can see easily, right? Like you can easily recognize like, yeah, there are, 3 Black people at this board meeting, but they are all pretty fair skinned and they all have like straight hair. And so we still have work to do in terms of not just what I call the checkbox diversity. And that's the thing about colorism and why sometimes it is hard to pinpoint, because we don't, like, society doesn't collect data on skin tone, right? Like every form we fill out, there's like, are you Black, African American, Latino, white, Latino, Black, Latino. And so race and ethnicity are well documented in the society, and we don't have time to talk about why and like the ramifications of that and like where that comes from. I think companies and organizations, when they're talking about diversity in particular, even with equity, right? Because when we do the census and we look at income disparities, again, the census is only collecting racial and ethnic data and not skin tone data. Then if that's the kind of information you're relying on, then a lot of people are missing that intersection of skin tone, that intersection of, hair and facial features. So we have to get beyond just the seeing an entire race or an entire ethnic group as being one and the same. And we definitely shouldn't assume that one person from a race or ethnicity is representative of that entire race or ethnicity. So I think that is an argument against tokenism. When we think about like monochromatic diversity, it very much forces us to avoid tokenism at all costs, right? Because the likelihood that just one person will represent or be able to speak for or be, I guess, representative. I used the best word the first time, so I should stop looking for synonyms of the entire group, I think is completely false. So I think those are some ways to recognize it. And then in terms of addressing it, the first thing that we can do as like individuals in the workplace is start to, again, notice it and then call people's attention to it, right? And so if there's already DEI work or, JEDI, DEIB, all the acronyms that people like to use, if there's already like a committee for that, already a space or a channel or an avenue for that, I think that's a very accessible first step that people today, right now, can take is email that person who's over the ERG, email that person who's over the affinity group, email your DEI director or the VP of global inclusion, like whoever your person is, like email them and said, hey, where does colorism fit into the overall strategy, right? Or, what's the next conversation on colorism going to be, And I think because the first step really is awareness. And when it comes to something like colorism, every time I speak about it, there are people in the audience who have never heard of it. Right. And so we can't address problems when people don't even know that they're a thing. And so I think everyone who's listening can help in the effort to spread awareness.
Yeah, I think of my own experience in DEI groups. I have never heard that topic brought up. And in sitting in those groups, sometimes I wonder if the group is even legitimate. Like what are we actually accomplishing? Because sometimes it seems, I don't know the right word for it. It seems like we're checking that box. Like you said, there's a box and we're putting a check in it and we're saying, oh, as a company, we're doing this, but what are we actually doing?
Right.
So I don't know. It wasn't a question. I just throwing that out there.
Well, and I wonder too, if there's some aspect of maybe kind of being happy with what we get kind of attitude of, well, at least they're hiring us. Now we got to get them to start talking about colorism too. I mean, do you know what I mean? Like, it's like, especially depending on where you work, that could be a huge hurdle to overcome. So I wonder if maybe there's some aspect of that going on too.
Yeah, no, there's definitely, so I don't know if we've said this yet, but there's definitely a lot of resistance to talking about colorism. No, we did allude to it. You said it was taboo. Yeah. There's a lot of resistance from the people you wouldn't expect. And that's one of the things I'm really focusing on this year is that even amongst people who are pro DEI, you would think are part of the choir that we're preaching to, a lot of times they're uncomfortable bringing colorism to the conversation. And I think that speaks to the fact that we all have work to do. And it's not just the cis white men that have work to do. I think even amongst people of color, even amongst women, even amongst other marginalized groups, we still might have privilege in terms of something like colorism. And so I think because it asks everyone, because every race, every ethnicity has work to do around colorism. I think it's actually kind of like really, really uncomfortable, because it's, well, one, I always say we should destigmatize, privilege anyway, like, because we've made it like a dirty word or like a insult, people run away from it instead of saying, no, I actually am privileged in this system, and here's how I'm going to try to help undo the system, right? But once we realize that we all have it, then it's less scary to own up to it, right? And take account for it and be responsible with it. But you're definitely right. Even when, we talk about representation, whether it be in politics or in media or in like upper level management or at the executive level, there very much is that conversation, or, oh, we should just be happy that they're hiring people of color. We should just be happy that, there's a Black person in office, or we should just be happy with X, Y, Z. And I think I've often said, as a dark-skinned person, I don't have the privilege to prioritize racism, right? I don't have the privilege to prioritize what other people say we should prioritize. And I use the analogy too, like in, amongst the civil rights movement, there was talk about the gender divide and how a lot of Black men in the civil rights, movement were saying, race first, the gender stuff second, like race first, the sexuality can come later, right? Or this can come later. And I think that is, what I say is, if we solve the problem that you think is most important, I'm going to be in the exact same position I am today, right? Especially with something like colorism. Even if we, quote unquote, did away with race and did away with racism, if colorism persists, I'm still at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? And so I don't have the benefits of prioritizing these other things first. But yeah, I think I'm at a point now where I don't have to just be satisfied that, oh, this person is also a woman of color. And so even if she is white presenting, she's a woman of color. And so that is the progress that I'm going to accept, right? And maybe it has often taken people like me who try to push us to the margins to actually make progress, right? Even it's never the mainstream people that are pushing society forward, right? It's always the people that are kind of like on the outliers that are kind of, nudging society forward. And so I think colorism is one of those issues at this point in time that is like saying, we got to do a little bit more than just, looking at racial equity as a monolithic thing.
You posted on Instagram a couple weeks ago, or a little over a week ago, something that speaks to this directly. Do you mind if I read it?
Yeah.
Okay. You wrote on Valentine's Day, you wrote, a common and long-standing attitude among many prominent and historic anti-racist leaders, activists, scholars, and practitioners is that colorism is a trivial distraction compared to racism. Those same individuals find themselves frustrated that the movement keeps spinning its wheels in the same old ruts. They fail to realize that colorism, the very thing they toss aside, is actually the lever necessary to gain traction. I can't say it any better than you just did. That it's got to be addressed, or we're just going to keep spinning our wheels. There's more to it. We're not a monolith. Race is not a monolith. There's more to racism than just, now there's people of color that we hired. There's more to it. So I applaud you for being an outlier and bringing that to the fore.
Yeah. I've also said something pretty controversial to a lot of people, which is that a lot of times what we attribute to racism is actually better understood through the lens of colorism. Because when we look at the research that disaggregates the data, that doesn't just look at, a racial group as a monolith, what they see is that the disparities are really not between, for example, white people and Black people, right? Or white Americans and, indigenous Americans are. It's really between the people with lighter skin tones and people with darker skin tones. So when we look at pay inequality, when we look at educational attainment, when we look at marriage rates, when we look at likelihood of being killed by the police, there's the gap between white people and very light-skinned people of color is negligible in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard for people to accept or to understand, right? It's not that there's never a gap or that there isn't any gap, but it's really small. And so when we talk about inequality, it's really the darker your skin tone, if we were looking at a graph, the wider the gap is. And so what people are trying to solve, if they look at just the entire race, one, there's a misunderstanding of the actual nature of the problem. And you can't adequately solve a problem if you're not looking at it correctly, if you're not looking at it through the right lens. And so I think it's the need to look at problems through the lens of colorism is, I don't know why people are so scared of it, but I think it will elucidate a lot of things about the problems we're trying to solve that would make our efforts way more efficient. And yes, light-skinned people get stopped by the cops, but when we look at Michael Brown, when we look at Eric Garner, when we look at George Floyd, when we look at even Breonna Taylor, right, and Sandra Bland, right, these people are brown to very dark-skinned people. They have full features. And so it's not that, you know, a light-skinned person isn't going to be profiled or harassed, but the people who are most likely to be in danger in this society, even looking at the medical devices called the pulse oximeter, where it's a device you put on people's finger, and it measures the level of oxygen in your blood. This is a device, so it's apart from people's bias. And the darker your skin tone, the more pigmentation you have in your skin, the less accurate the reading is of your oxygen levels, right? It's because
I didn't know that.
It was trained or tested towards white people, right? And so if you are a Black person with a skin tone closer to a white person's skin tone, there's less of an impact on you with this medical device. But if you are a person of color with a very brown, very dark, or a lot of pigmentation, a lot of melanin in your skin, there's a greater risk of misreading oxygen levels in your blood, right, in the ER. You know, there's pushback because people say, oh, well, we already know that that's a thing, so we're taught to account for it, right? But why aren't the people designing these devices held accountable for testing them?
Exactly, fix it.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. I say all that to say that there's so much that the lens of colorism can give people in their fight against these other systems.
Well, I know we're on limited time and I could ask you a million questions, but is there anything that you wanted to share with our audience that you didn't get a chance to talk about?
That's a great question. I think we really covered the big points. I will also say too that when we look at the future and where we're possibly headed as a society, I want to acknowledge that we're talking about colorism now way more than we ever have in the past. When I started my blog in 2011, it was extremely hard, extremely rare to see anyone using that term, seeing anyone using that language. And now I think this very podcast episode is proof of that. The fact that we are making inroads into raising that awareness, increasing that awareness. And then the other thing I'll say too is that there is a lot of academic research out there, but even if we don't have access to that, because I think a lot of academic research is not accessible to the general public, I think we can start to do our own observations, right? So if we can't afford the $35 article published in the law review of some fancy journal, right? We can start to pay attention to the news media when people are arrested on TV and they show a mugshot. I worked at the TV station and I noticed that every time the suspect was Black, they happened to include a mugshot of that person, right? But anytime the suspect was white, they didn't have a mugshot for some reason. And there's this reinforcement of that visual narrative, that visual imagery. So I think whether you do the more academic or scientific research or not, just start to do your own research, your own field studies of when I look at TV, when I watch movies, when I go to my child's school, what do my child's teachers look like? What do the state representatives and the Congress people in my town look like, right? And just be observant, I think is my biggest ask, is to start being observant for yourself and then find the courage to also speak up and say, hey, did you notice this thing? Or, hey, have you heard of this thing, to the people that are around you?
Wow.
I will do
Dr.
that.
Webb, yes. Dr. Webb, thank you so much
Thank you
for first of all, for starting your blog back in 2011 and starting to have the conversation and being that outlier and pushing people to have the conversations and to start noticing things and to demystifying all of this for us. Because I mean, we can't make any changes if we don't start talking about it. We got to start somewhere. So thank you for your work, and thank you for continuing to do this. I think you've given all of us a lot to think about.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, Dr. Webb.
Bye.
That was a fantastic conversation. I feel like as much as we went into, I feel like we're just at the tip of the iceberg.
I know there's so much to talk about, and it was just like a little
teaser, a little bit. But how lucky are we that we, and I know you don't believe in luck, so I got to find another way to say this. But
I was going to tell you that.
But how great that we were able to have this conversation with somebody who is doing this work and can help guide us on our journey of having the discussions, but can also help us to maybe guide other people in their journeys of having the discussions or even just having the realizations. I feel like I've always known about colorism. My own family is like Benetton, for crying out loud. I mean, it's like a rainbow of Black people.
You just dated yourself, Benetton.
My entire family is just like, all the shades of Black people, right? And shades of all kinds of other people. So I feel like I've always known about it, but I think it's only recently that people have been having the conversations to the degree and with the frequency that they are now. It's fantastic that Dr. Webb is doing this work. I hope she continues to do it, and I hope more people do more of it so that she's not the only one doing the heavy lifting.
I want to go back and give kudos to Jessica and Nikita, who were on episode 51, Women of Color in Business, because they are the ones that originally brought up this topic on the podcast. And since they brought it up and said, hey, we need to have more of a discussion around colorism, we have been searching and just happened upon Dr. Webb because she has everybody look her up. She has amazing stuff. Listen to the TED Talk, follow her stuff on LinkedIn.
Yep.
There's lots of free information out there. And then I'd also like to say, if we can find a way to support and pay for her work, that would be amazing as well.
Amen. Very good.
Thank you again to Jess and Nikita, because you are the ones that brought this up in the first place.
Yes. Thank you, ladies, for bringing that up. And yeah, y'all lit a fire under us to get somebody on here to explore the topic
and to learn
in a fuller way. Yeah, and I'm sure this won't be the last time we talk about colorism. Now that we've opened the seal, there's going to be more conversations about it.
There's so much, because I just think that the thing I want to learn more about now is the intersectionality about, okay, we're talking about colorism, but are we also talking about able-bodyism? And then I like that she brought up the fact that she's a thin Black woman. And here I am, I hate this term, we talked about this last episode, but a bigger bodied white woman. We all have different levels of privilege, etc. And wouldn't it be a great world if we could acknowledge that and move forward? Yeah.
And I like that she talked about the instances with the police and, the
big time,
all of the things that we hear about, that it's not always, but it's darker skinned Black. And it's funny, when she was bringing it up, one thought that kept popping up in my head was, nobody's going to look at me and be intimidated by me. I mean, yes, I'm a Black woman, but I don't think anybody would characterize me as a dark, like, oh, yeah, somebody will shoot me. Sure. I mean, I'm still a Black woman. I'm still Black from a distance, but a darker skinned person, is probably going to be seen as more intimidating than I will.
It's fucking bullshit.
It is. It's all bullshit. We all
It's
know
fucking
race
bullshit.
is a construct, and it's all crap.
But all of it,
it's all in there. It's all in all of us. We've all been conditioned with all of this. Like Dr. Webb said, I forget how she said it, but you're born in water, so you're wet. So I mean,
yeah. But listen, Raquel,
I just did.
but
it makes sense.
You said that you grew up automatically thinking, or you were conditioned to think, because it's not automatic, it's data that you're taking in, your brain is taking it in all day long.
Yeah.
That you automatically assumed, and I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit, so don't get mad at me. You automatically assumed that any woman who was lighter skinned than you or had longer hair than you was more beautiful. So guess what you also assumed? Anybody who had shorter hair than you or was more dark skinned than you was not as beautiful as you.
No, see, I never made that assumption.
You didn't?
No, like I said, my assumptions about that were all turned toward me. They weren't turned toward other people.
So you don't think you have any internal bias that makes you feel that way? Like if you saw a woman,
because I mean, I see plenty of like dark women, short hair, whatever, that I just think are absolutely gorgeous.
So you think everybody's
beautiful.
Better looking than you?
Well, shit.
I didn't prove a point here, but what I was trying to say is that when there's a hierarchy,
maybe I've got some esteem issues to work on.
Yeah. But what I'm trying to say is when there is a hierarchy, we all fit on the hierarchy, at least in our head. This is not real, but we all fit in the hierarchy somewhere.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And for me, it was around weight. Like if someone was thinner than me, they were better looking than me. If someone was fatter than me, then I was better looking than them. And that's just like, and what is this whole thing with what we look like? Like I could go on and on and on about this episode.
Yeah.
It brings up so much about the hierarchy and why as a society we have to have these systems in place.
Right.
Systems of control.
Mm-hmm.
They're controlling us and they're making us all be piece of the hierarchy so that we can other the other person and feel better than them.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I might not be the boss, but I'm better than that person down there that's 5 rungs below me on the hierarchy.
Right. And as Dr. Webb said, I still had the conditioning. Yes, it's internalized and I think it's my own thinking, but I have that thinking because of the conditioning. I perceived that women, and to some extent still do, that women that are lighter than me are prettier because society has shown me in so many instances.
And I think that what Dr. Webb said, and also what our last guest, Christina Bruce, both said very clearly, watch what you're taking in. Yep. Clean up your Instagram feed. Clean up what you're watching on YouTube. If you can, limit the things that are reinforcing these systems and start to follow an audience that is breaking free from it.
Yeah,
that's exactly what we can do. And for the people who have children out there, expose them to things that are breaking the system.
Absolutely.
Let's break this freaking system because it sucks for everybody.
Yeah, and a point of hope. It is possible to break this system. It is possible. It is possible to do this. We just have to do the work. It is possible to do it.
I agree.
We just have to do it.
And we have to recognize it when it's happening, recognizing that this is an issue because we have eyes. The first thing that we see is what someone looks like, what their shape is, what color they are, what their hair looks like. We visually see this person and we make all kinds of assumptions.
Yep.
Our little computer brain goes tick, 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 and spits out the nonsense.
Yep. Exactly. Well, and Dr. Webb said colorism is a very significant issue that needs to be addressed. It's not just racism, it's also colorism.
And maybe people don't want to talk about it because they realize that we can talk racism and sexism and all these things in our culture, and we're not really getting anywhere. But if we got to the root of it, the root colorism, maybe we could bust some butt and change something.
Yep.
But they don't want to talk about it.
Nope.
They don't want to talk about it, and they don't want to acknowledge it, because if you acknowledge it, you have to acknowledge where you sit in that structure.
That's probably a really scary thing for people to think about and to admit. Oh shit, I do have privilege.
Yeah, we all have some kind of privilege, right?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe there are some people that have absolutely no privilege. There may be.
Maybe.
But I have the privilege that I never have in my entire life suffered for a meal. My family was well fed. I mean, that's a privilege.
Yeah, I have privilege. I'm educated. I have a roof over my head. I live in a safe home. I'm able-bodied. Privilege is a continuum, and everybody is on it somewhere.
Exactly. And I think that is the root of the work and the discussion. And I had so many people tell me, well, I'm not privileged because, my family struggled or whatever, and I'm a white guy. Okay, so in that regard, you didn't have privilege, but look at all of these other areas where you did. It's not one or the other. It's not I did or didn't have privilege. It's I didn't have some and I had lots more.
Yep, right? It's a continuum.
It's a continuum, and that's what we're in, such a society of black and white thinking, of yes or no, or it is or it isn't. It's like the dichotomy, when it really is more like we can hold these things to both be true at the same time.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm so glad we're talking about this.
I know, it was fascinating. Wasn't that a fascinating discussion?
So good. I could talk to Dr. Webb for hours, and I'm sure she has so much more to say about colorism. People, check her out.
Follow her Instagram. Every Monday she goes on Instagram Live, LinkedIn Live, and she does a discussion about what's going on in colorism. Fascinating.
Yeah, she's amazing. And listen to her TED Talk, y'all. It is amazing. Such a good TED Talk. So good.
Bye, Raquel.
Bye, Jennifer. Thanks, everyone, for listening today. We will be back with more Madness Cafe next week. You can find us on Instagram at Madness Cafe Podcast or email us at madnesscafepodcast@gmail.com. Bye.